Hello, thank you for showing up. Okay, so let's see here. So today we're covering the final assignment of the semester, and that is Reconstruction. All right. So I hope that everything was rectified with the last assignment, as it wasn't properly pasted on there. So I went back and redid it, and then left a message for you guys, which hopefully was clear and what I'm expecting. And so you have until the 15th, until the end of the semester, to turn that in. And of course, it's not late, no matter when you do it, but by that time. And so thank you. And so now, with the culmination of the war, you have the era of Reconstruction. And note, right, that there are going to be some legacies that have to be dealt with at the end of this war, that didn't just go away just because the North, or the Union, the 19 states in the North, defeated the 11 states in the South. So they ended up defeating them at Appomattox, right? Lee's army was surrounded at Appomattox by Ord to the east, by William Tecumseh Sherman to the southwest, and then coming in from the northwest, King Grant's army, Ulysses Grant. So at any rate, no sooner is the war over than the president is assassinated, right? Literally right at the first days at the end of the war. He was shot in Ford's Theater in Baltimore, and he is succeeded by someone he tried to balance a ticket with, a Republican who was anti-planter class, was a self-made man who kind of thought of himself as like an Andrew Jackson, but did not have much love for African Americans, and he didn't even try to hide it ever. So now we find this type of guy in control in the White House, right? Well, the legacies you have to deal with, just to begin with, right? You have a legacy of libertarianism in the South. They hate big government. They don't like government telling them what to do. They want government to stay small and localized, and it's the states first to the Union, right? And so that is an impediment that has to be dealt with. The legacy of racial fear and hatred, needless to say, ran very deeply, and they're having to contend with that, right? Remember, Jefferson had said, "We have the wolf by the ears, and we dare not let him go," for fear of past injustices. The white population was afraid that the black people would immediately, upon empowerment and freedom, would seek revenge, right? And so there was that great racial divide that you have to contend with. And then that libertarian strain was exacerbated during the war, and there was a great distrust of Yankees, of Northerners, as if they have a completely foreign culture, foreign institutions, and like they were being occupied by a foreign country. Okay, you see those. That's not an exaggeration to state when you look at a lot of the primary sources of that time period. And so they have their hands full. And then, of course, another legacy that they have created, and that is a destroyed South, right? Most of the war was fought in the South, and there was great destructions to crops, to the economy that was riding high off of cotton, so forth. It continued throughout the war, but not the same. Not the same. It was greatly hurt. Okay. Whatever little infrastructure the South had, leaders of the North like Sherman burned them to the ground. And so they had to kind of restart with railroads, telecommunication, telegraph wires, etc. And so you have a lot going on, right? So they win the war. And so the new president acts as if he is doing it out of lenience, because, see, the country bought it when it came from Lincoln. Lincoln proved his credentials. He said he would not allow slavery to spread anywhere further to the west. As the war grew and continued, he began confiscating slaves from Southerners who lost in battle with the congressional help with the Confiscation Acts. He issued his Emancipation Proclamation, which granted only declared the slaves of rebels to be freed. But you see his speeches, his second inaugural address, as opposed to his first. He was beginning to sound much more like an abolitionist, okay? Blaming the war on the sin of slavery, which he did in his second inaugural address. So at any rate, he had proven his credentials to the North. So when, he had lost a son, he had very visibly aged during the war. There were many, many losses and low periods for the Union Army. He was afraid he wouldn't even get reelected, even in just the northern states in 1864, with the Copperhead Democrats saying that they would put an end to the war immediately and that this war was unnecessary, etc. They had a lot of popularity in the North. And so at any rate, he had been through so much that when Lincoln said, you know what, I want to be lenient to the South and letting them back in, that's exactly how it was commonly interpreted, is that this guy's tired of war. He's proven his credentials. It's just that. But when Johnson implemented his simple plan for the South to be reunited, re-annexed as states again, people didn't buy it. They saw it as a pro-Southern bias because he had not shown such credentials during the war, and he was a Southerner from Tennessee. So at any rate, all they have to do is declare adherence to the 13th Amendment, which formally abolished slavery. And he made it very easily for them to write a new state constitution and don't worry about enfranchising the African Americans at all with any kind of citizenship rights, and let him in quite easily. Then in the meantime, before they would have gubernatorial elections for governors, he would handpick governors. And the handpicked governors that he chose were racist white men. Okay. And so it didn't take long for the new legislators that were easily brought back into the Union, as well as their governors, to pass a series of black codes. And the black codes did everything to try to marginalize and keep down the African Americans. They could not enter many different fields as far as occupation. They had to have evidence of employment contracts. And of course, the employment contracts were always offered to them by way of their old masters, the planter class owning the plantations. And so they were pressured to go back to their plantations and do virtually the same work, except this time they technically had to be remunerated. They had to be paid. But just to make sure that they would get paid, Congress passed a very lukewarm act, an economic act, Civil Rights Act for African Americans, guaranteeing their right to be remunerated in pay and to seek loans, business loans, home loans, to be able to buy and rent property, just basic economic rights. And he vetoed it. And then the Freedmen's Bureau was sent down there during the war to adjudicate disputes. That means like to arbitrate, like a referee, disputes between black and white Southerners, to provide comfort and aid to African Americans. And they needed an extension. And he vetoed that as well and said that they were a discriminatory organization because they were only helping black Southerners and not white. So this happens, and you have a Reconstruction committee, and they sent men down into the South, and they came up with the same evidence that the South was, quote, unrepentant. They were not sorry for the war. They were even more bitter. They were even harsher against African Americans. Because, mind you, they had laws like vagrancy laws. African Americans were looking for loved ones who had been sold away. And if they were found loitering or trespassing on someone's property, they were given a stiff fine, which they could not pay, right? If they didn't have a work contract on them at a given time, a stiff fine was placed upon them that they could not pay. Their masters, their old masters, agreed to pay their fees, and they had to come back to the plantations and work those fees off. And so it was basically slavery in everything but name. They were circumventing, they were getting around the 13th Amendment by still virtually enslaving the African Americans. So when the committee has its meeting, they decide that radical change has to be done. And the term that was used at that time period, what they did is they were able to wave the bloody shirt. Waving the bloody shirt, the Yankee shirt, right, was to remind Northerners how many Yankees had died in the Civil War, which was over 300,000. So they're basically saying, right, our boys died in vain. They died for nothing because the South is unrepentant. They're not changing. Nothing is changing, and all was fought in vain. So that brought about the 1866 congressional election results, whereby a lot of radical Republicans were elected into office. Now they were ready to go to war, not only with the South, but with their own president. And so it was an equal and opposite reaction to how backward and pro-South the president was, right? And so there was momentum at this time now. So what they did, right, is they took roll in both houses, and they didn't call the name of a single Southerner. They said, oh, sorry, we don't recognize you. You're back to territories, and you have to reapply again as states. Then in the new state constitutions, they had to approve the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment was pretty big. That granted all the rights, privileges, and protections of citizenship to anyone born or naturalized in any of the states. All right. And so, of course, that was intended to cover all the Black Americans, the Black American men who had been born in this country, and enfranchise them with all the rights of citizenship. And so at any rate, in addition to that, they kept the cavalry units and soldiers down in the South to protect the Black community. They also, in Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, stated that if you at any given time had sworn an oath to defend the Constitution, and then you subsequently, after that, joined the Confederate effort of rebellion and leaving the country, then you clearly had broken your oath, and you were to be disenfranchised for 2 years. So for 2 years, you could not be a citizen in your own state. And that was the punitive part. A lot of them called it the ironclad oath. And so at any rate, that disenfranchised a lot of the old leadership, right? Because if you went high as an officer in the military, or if you went high as a politician, you at one given time had to give an oath of allegiance to the Constitution. So that now, because of the disenfranchisement of the old Confederate leadership, now these new elections, they gave a chance to the African Americans and to the Republican Party in the South. And so then some Republicans, thousands actually, migrated down into the South to be a part of this renewal of the South, right? And the Southerners called them carpetbaggers, implying that they were parasites coming down when the South was down and at its lowest point to enrich themselves from it. And then you also had the African Americans, the freedmen, who were now free and enfranchised. And then you also had the Southern white population, tiny part of the population, who were brave enough to vote with the Republican Party against slavery. And so they were known as the scalawags, or the traitors to the South. So at this time, during radical or congressional Reconstruction, it was known as this radical phase because everything turned upside down. The old enemies of the white antebellum elite are now running the show. Carpetbaggers from the North, African American ex-slaves, and not just ex-slaves, but African Americans, and because there had always been a freed population in certain cities in the South, and the white Republicans in the South. So they were known as the hated triumvirate. Well, when they came in, they didn't waste much time. At first, they dabbled with the idea of land redistribution, but that didn't stick. You had Field Order Number 15 by the Armed Forces to give 40 acres and a mule to every ex-slave, with the common argument is because of their unrequited labor. They had worked for years and years and were never requited with any kind of a wage, and that should earn them the right to a 40-acre spot. So the Supreme Court turned against them, said that the actual white owners of that land had never been convicted of a crime, and so therefore they were entitled to their Fifth Amendment rights to their property, and the land was given back to the old Confederate leaders. But they tried that. Then they did a lot to try to break the oligarchy of the South. Right? Remember, oligarchy is ruled by the few at the expense of the many, and they did pretty well in doing it, evidently, according to Eric Foner, the most popular historian on this topic. He contends that they guaranteed the entrance of more capital from Europe and from the North, people that were willing to give business and home loans to African Americans to start a business and to buy a home. You also had the development of certain industries in the South to have them not be a monolithic culture of just relying upon cotton alone. So they started to diversify economically. They started to kind of envision Hamilton's vision, right, for the South as well as the North. Industrialization, commercialization, urbanization, okay? And they helped bring some of that about in the South, and kind of broke the power of the old elite before the Civil War. Okay, and they never really regained it the same. So good came out of this for sure. They established safety net legislation. They established public school systems for Black and white kids to go to together. They established orphanages and asylums, prisons with prison reform, and these other things that cost a lot of money. Okay, so then as a couple of years go by, what one state after another began to do is they fell indebted, because good Southern libertarians, they don't want to be taxed. They fight every inch of it, and so they weren't bringing in enough revenue for the money that they were spending on these new institutions, and so it was beginning to hurt the states economically. All right. Then at that time, there was a big white backlash against this period, as you could imagine, the enemies running their states. You had the cries of Black misrule or Negro misrule, because you did. In the 1870s, you have evidence of nepotism, of people getting in political positions and giving the positions to their family members and friends. You have, of course, bribery, when you have two different companies that want to provide the railroad transportation through your town, and one of them bids higher, and so you take the higher bid and you officially take that bribe to go with that railroad. And then you also had graft, when you'd find out about an economic development that was going to happen in the future, and you acted on it privately to enrich yourself. And according to historians like W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a big leader of the African American community in the early 1900s, when he wrote his history of Reconstruction as an African American, he said, yes, some of this did happen. He said, but nowhere near to the degree that it was happening with white politicians everywhere in the country. And so the press ran with this, and they threw the Black politicians under the bus. So you have Black politicians like Blanche K. Bruce, who became the father of Black education, known as such. You had Hiram Revels, who was a congressman and was behind a lot of good causes. You had Francis Cardoso, who was a brilliant budgetary man with money and running the budget of Louisiana. And so some of them were very dignified men and did very well, and it didn't matter. The press ran with this Negro misrule title, and the white Republicans didn't stand by the Black Republicans, and they began to try to distance themselves, according to Eric Foner, and so that they could continue to be elected. And they let the Black people kind of go under the bus. All right. And then, of course, after 2 years, you had the re-enfranchisement of the Confederate elite, because they were only disenfranchised for 2 years. And so now they're given back their citizenship rights, and they are very adept or skillful at their political skills of trying to get back in office. You have the growth of the KKK, and supposedly, I'm surprised it wasn't higher than this, but 1/5, 1 out of every 5 African Americans who went to a poll to vote was physically attacked, and but yet they still, practicing their agency, they still came to the votes in over 90% fashion. So over 90% of eligible Black voters were still voting. Amongst the African Americans, they kind of initially adhered to their own elite, and the elite were those oftentimes at first who had never been slaves. So they probably had greater societal esteem given to them. And as African American businessmen, etc., in these enclaves like Charleston and Savannah and other cities where free Black Americans could do their thing. So they kind of naturally looked to them. They naturally looked to preachers, to Black preachers, and they naturally looked to those who had served as soldiers in the Civil War. But within about 2 years, they began electing people that were straight from the plantations, ex-slaves who had worked out in the fields, some of whom were not even literate and had to pay for a scribe to like interpret stuff for them, read stuff for them, write stuff for them, etc. And so at any rate, in time, you got to remember, this is a 12-year span from 1865 to 77. The North just kind of lost interest. There were other things going on by the 1870s. The fight with the Lakota in the West, the native tribes, and the Apache, the drama with the robber barons, all that was going on. So the North kind of lost its zeal, right, to want to change the South. And the Southerners just kind of outlasted them. And so then finally it ends with a presidential candidate where neither got the electoral majority. So according to the Constitution, it goes to the House, and they choose the top 2 with the top highest points of electoral points. And they decide in the House. And Mr. Rutherford B. Hayes promised the House, especially the Southerners therein, that if they were to choose him instead of Samuel Tilden of New York, that he would remove the soldiers from the South. And they did. They chose him, and he removed the soldiers. And then at that point, it was like all of the progress that had happened had been like swallowed up. And it didn't take long, but just a couple of years, and you have the implementation of the Jim Crow laws that okayed segregation, that disenfranchised African Americans virtually, and so forth. So they had grandfather clauses, they had poll taxes, they had literacy tests, they had a myriad of ways to try to marginalize African Americans. And they had segregated now facilities with everything publicly, with public accommodations, including school. All right. So when the going got tough, that zeal, it waned, it died down. The Republicans folded. They didn't have lasting power to keep and sustain that change. All right. And then number 2, and pretty simple, is I just say that legal remedies will never completely resolve a social issue, right? Because the social issue is hatred and distrust and fear for African Americans. So no matter what laws you pass, if you don't deal with that and pull that up by the root, you're still going to have major inequities, instances of unfairness and discrimination in the South. So that's my simple thesis for number 2. So I talk about how there were opportunities for some type of social change to be brought about, and they dropped the ball on every occasion. So for one, right, was the military and the government. As they were winning over these military states of the Confederacy, they had a chance to implement programs to like send Black and white kids together into schooling and try to have a more egalitarian footing for Black and white. And oftentimes when you look at Benjamin Butler and a lot of the Union Northern generals who confiscated these slaves, they treated them like dirt. They were annoyed by them. They thought that they slowed their army down and wasted useful resources, etc. And so the government and the military definitely dropped the ball. And then I said, in addition to that, what about the churches? Why didn't the churches do something? They did something in the antebellum period in the North to help bring about more egalitarian, ideology to be embraced by people, but they never did it in the South. And so it's no surprise that the Black people just separated from the white churches in the South and formed their own Black churches. Okay, so the white churches kind of dropped the ball. And then what about the intelligentsia? The intelligentsia mean like the creators of school systems and those who were writers, etc. Right? The power of the pen. They dropped the ball. They too dropped the ball as far as trying to teach cosmopolitanism, right? If everybody's a citizen of the whole world, and diversity is a beautiful thing, etc. Egalitarianism, everyone on equal footing. They just dropped the ball. Right? And so at any rate, yeah, you have that. And so I noticed the last sentence: legal and institutional remedies will never suffice for a problem in the human head and heart. Racism was never uprooted at its sources. So legislation arguably constitutes a great start. It can't nor ever will suffice in eradicating racism. All right, so you guys have any questions?
I had one. I was just curious if the test 3 is going to get opened up.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, really, I couldn't stop you from doing open note anyway, as you take it online. But I'm all for it being open note anyway, even if I had you in person.
Oh no, I meant like, are we able to start that test 3, or is that next week's goal?
You know what? I don't know. I haven't been in a hurry, to be honest, but I have no problem with putting it up earlier. If it's not up there right now, I'll look, okay? And I have no problem with posting it soon.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was going through the notes that you put on for the study guide, and so I was just curious if the test was going to get opened up, or when you were planning on opening it.
Yeah, you know what? I will open it as soon as possible, and I'll do you one better. I'm also going to put in 2 opportunities. I'll let you guys have 2 shots at it, and then the system will embrace the higher of the 2 scores.
Cool, that's awesome.
Thank you.
No problem.
I have a question.
I'm happy. Go ahead, Brennan.
So this test is just going to be these last few assignments after test 2, correct? Or it's going to be all of them? Okay.
Exactly. So yeah, it's not accumulative. It's not accumulative from the beginning of the semester. To me, you've already been tested on that previous stuff. So this final is just simply test 3 of the stuff that we haven't been tested on yet.
Cool. Thank you.
All right. All right, guys. Well, I wish you well. Thank you for coming. You'll get your extra credit points, and I will look at that right now as soon as I get off here, and make sure that that's available, and make sure that you guys have 2 shots at it.
One
Thanks,
more,
Professor.
Oh, sorry. Go, Brennan.
Oh no, I was just saying thank you. I don't have a question.
Oh, I was gonna say, are we having a Zoom meeting next week?
Yeah, and you know what? I was gonna kind of go over the test.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds cool.
All right.
Sounds good to me.
All right, guys.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. All right, so thank you for coming, guys. I'm gonna go ahead and call it quits for today, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Have a good week.
Thank you, guys. You too. Have a good week. Thank you.